They said it couldn't grow, that sweetness could not survive the sand. But we weren't farming fruit, we were farming freedom.
Captain Ibrahim Traore. At dawn the order came, not a whisper, not a request, a declaration. 100 million pineapples. Across the frontier, where the desert had swallowed villages and turned soil to dust, the people of Burkina Faso were told plant, not to decorate, not to impress, but to defend. It sounded impossible, perhaps even absurd. But Traore's vision was never about easy wins. It was about reclaiming the power to imagine. For too long, this nation had been described with a single-word drought. Now he offered another sweetness. Not the kind you taste, the kind you believe in, the kind that survives storms and tells your children they are more than a statistic. What if a fruit could fight a desert? What if planting became a form of resistance? And what if just maybe the world had underestimated a people long enough? If you've ever believed that even dry land can bloom with dignity, stay with us, because what you're about to witness will not be shown on the evening news. In the northern reaches of Burkina Faso, the desert doesn't arrive with a roar. It comes grain by grain. Each year, it takes a little more a pasture here, a well there, a memory of what once was fertile. Farmers have watched their footprints fade behind them, swallowed by advancing dunes. What was once grassland is now an unmarked battlefield between survival and erosion. For decades, solutions were flown in, not planted. International programs came with charts and consultants, promising trees that could hold back the Sahara. Some grew, most didn't. Irrigation projects dried up. Millions were spent. But the sand kept moving. Burkina Faso became part of a larger story, one too familiar across Africa. A story told in donor reports, policy papers, and satellite images. A story of loss, of land, of harvests, of hope. The world saw a country always recovering, never deciding. But something else was happening beneath the dust, a quiet frustration. Not just with the desert, but with the way others saw it. As if drought was destiny. As if aid was the only tool left. Then came Captain Ibrahim Traore, a young soldier, a student of land and memory. He didn't speak like a bureaucrat. He spoke like a man who knew what it meant to walk on cracked soil. He didn't ask what the world thought could grow. He asked what his people were still brave enough to plant. Why pineapples? Why here? Because imagination was the one crop that had never been cultivated on this frontier. And because, as Traore told his ministers, we will not beg the desert for mercy. We will challenge it with vision. To the outside world, the land seemed barren. But to those who lived there were still roots, still stories, still hands willing to try one more time. This wasn't just about fruit. It was about reimagining the future, not with blueprints and reports, but with shovel sweat and a stubborn kind of hope. The announcement didn't come with a press release. It came with urgency. 100 million pineapples. It sounded like fiction, something whispered in villages before being laughed off at dinner. But Captain Ibrahim Traore wasn't asking for applause. He was asking for participation from every family, every school, every soldier. The plan wasn't for next year. It began immediately. Across the dry belt where the Sahara crept south, a new vision emerged. Not a wall of concrete, but a living wall of green. Pineapples, spiky resilient, quietly defiant, would be the front line. Why pineapples? Because they survive where others fail. Their thick leaves trap moisture. Their roots stabilize shifting soil. Their fruits bring vitamins to undernourished communities. And their value on global markets rivals that of gold without the cost of extraction. To Traore, this wasn't just a crop. It was a statement. For decades, development experts had proposed solutions from afar: drones, satellites, genetically modified grains. But Traore believed in something older, something tactile. If you want to stop the desert, he argued, you start with your own hands. The Wall of Sweetness, as it came to be called, had 3 missions. First, to defend the land. Rows of pineapples would act as a barrier, slowing the desert's reach. Unlike trees that take years to mature pineapple's fruit in just 18 months, their low profile and thick leaves made them less vulnerable to winds. They could survive on poor soil with little water, and crucially, they could anchor the frontier in place. Second, to feed the people. Malnutrition had long haunted Burkina Faso's rural north. Pineapples, rich in vitamin C and fiber, could become a local staple, affordable, nutritious, and homegrown. Third, to build a new economy. The plan was never to just grow fruit. It was to transform it into juice, dried snacks, wine, into jobs, into exports, into dignity. But planting was only the beginning. What made the project revolutionary was the way it was carried out. Traore didn't hide behind speeches. He picked up a shovel. Helicopters dropped crates of pineapple suckers into remote villages. Soldiers worked beside farmers, planting row after row. Students were taught not just how pineapples grow, but why they mattered. Planting became ritual, purpose, almost prayer. Women's cooperatives were empowered to run nurseries and manage supply chains. Youth brigades dug trenches. Agricultural schools hosted workshops on mulching soil, moisture retention, pest management. A national curriculum emerged around cultivation. Pineapples were no longer just a crop, they were a national symbol of resistance. The scale was staggering. Suckers were sourced from Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, then multiplied in local nurseries. Entire sectors of the country pivoted toward one goal: to see sweetness rise from sand. Not everyone believed. Critics, especially from abroad, dismissed it as a spectacle. Populist agriculture, some called it. Fantasy farming. Headlines scoffed. Why not bananas in Antarctica, they joked. But for Burkinabe communities, tired of programs that came and went of aid, that disappeared before it arrived, the idea was strangely magnetic. If grapes had grown the year before, if dragon fruit had survived. Why not pineapples? Traore didn't promise perfection. He promised effort. If 1 in 10 survives, he told his advisors, that's 10 million pineapples. 10 million reasons to believe. And that, more than anything, was his genius. He understood that the battle for land was also a battle for imagination. That after years of headlines about hunger and hardship, people needed something tangible, something they could hold, taste, plant. This wasn't just farming. It was recovery. It was ownership. It was the beginning of a new story. The world didn't know it yet, but in the dust of Burkina Faso, a movement had taken root. The desert doesn't retreat quietly. It tests, it waits, and then it hits. Just weeks after the first season's planting, the Sahel reminded everyone that it was still king. Sandstorms blew across the frontier like ghosts. They buried young pineapple crowns under dunes of windblown grit. Goats, attracted by the sudden green, broke into fields before fencing could be completed. When the rain stopped, heat came back with a vengeance. Irrigation lines cracked, seedlings withered, and the whispers began. This is what we feared, some muttered. The desert can't be tamed. International experts quietly circulated reports predicting failure. Western newspapers ran headlines dripping with sarcasm. Pineapples in the Sahara. The jokes returned. The doubt deepened. But Traore never blinked. Instead, he turned every setback into spectacle and every hardship into a rallying cry. When seedlings were buried, he issued a call to action: uncover the crowns of sovereignty. He told the nation. State radio carried the message, and across the country, families, children included, began digging. Not just for plants, but for proof that effort mattered. When goats chewed through rows, the army responded. But not with bullets, with thorns. Soldiers built fences from cactus and dry brush, spiky barriers that mirrored the pineapples themselves, rough, local, and unyielding. Each solution came from the land itself. No foreign blueprint, just resilience. Behind the scenes, scientists adapted fast. They introduced mulching with dry grasses to trap moisture. Farmers dug traditional zai pits to catch and store rare rainfall. In some areas, acacia trees were planted nearby their shade, giving pineapples a better chance to survive. To outside eyes, it looked chaotic. To those inside, it was innovation in motion. This was more than agriculture. It was improvisation. It was survival. And slowly, the land began to listen. By the end of the first year, only 30% of the original seedlings had survived. In most development reports, that would be labeled a failure. But Traore had always measured success differently. 30 million crowns still stand, he told his cabinet. 30 million fruits the world said we couldn't grow? 30 million pieces of proof. He toured the harshest zones himself, walking through wilted fields, speaking to farmers not with pity, but with resolve. His message? The desert will fight, but we will fight harder. State media captured it all. Images of him sweating under the sun, digging with villagers. Not staged, not for show. But to send one clear message: we are in this together. Then it happened. In one village, a small crown pushed through the sand. Then another. Then hundreds more. The first pineapples, small golden fierce, began to ripen. Children carried them into market where they sold instantly. Women sliced and dried them in the sun, labeling the bags, desert sweetness. Buyers in the capital paid double not just for the fruit, but for the story. And with that, everything shifted. What was once mocked became admired. What had been dismissed as impossible was now sold in baskets. What had been buried quite literally had survived. International media, once skeptical, began sending crews to film the fields. Environmental groups praised the unexpected success. Aid agencies who had offered nothing now wanted their logos on the victory. But Traore didn't let the moment slip away. He reminded the world, we planted with our hands, not with their money. This wall belongs to Burkina Faso. And for the first time in years, Burkina farmers stood at the desert's edge, not in fear, but in pride. This was not the end of the fight, but it was proof of something rare and powerful, that even in land called barren, something sweet can grow. That failure, if owned and fought through, becomes a kind of freedom, and that the desert, for all its strength, had finally met its match. The desert didn't vanish. It still loomed vast, dry, eternal. But now it was met by something new: resistance, green resistance. By the second planting season, survival rates improved. Farmers, now better trained, spaced their rows, carefully used mulch to trap moisture, and intercropped pineapples with hardy native shrubs. They no longer hoped for miracles. They had systems. Satellite images began to show, at first, long green belts stretching across Burkina Faso's northern border, weaving like threads through sand. To some, it looked like defiance in digital form. To locals, it was simply progress. The harvest arrived, not with ceremony, but with weight, literal weight. Thousands of tons of pineapples began ripening across the frontier. The sweet scent drifted into towns that once smelled only of dust. Donkeys' bikes and carts loaded with fruit moved along roads once used by refugees. Now they carried abundance. Markets overflowed. Not just in Ouagadougou or Bobo-Dioulasso, but in towns that used to depend on imported food. Prices didn't crash from low demand. They dropped because there was so much fruit every family could afford to eat. In villages where millet had once been the only staple, children now drank pineapple juice. Women's cooperatives dried slices, packaged them as Bifaso Gold, and sold them in bulk. Teenagers opened juice stands. Small processing units popped up, pressing fruit into concentrate for sodas and jams. What began as a defensive planning campaign had become an economic engine. Traore saw the momentum and moved fast. He banned exclusive contracts with foreign corporations. We will export fruit, he declared, but not our sovereignty. Export rights were granted only to local cooperatives and national trade boards. The profits stayed home. The people stayed employed. The pride stayed intact. Factories opened in Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and Kaya. Jobs multiplied. Youth who once dreamed of migration now dreamed of branding their own products. Villages formed associations to negotiate shipping deals. Farmers learned logistics, not just planting. This was not just a crop. It was a curriculum in ownership. The ecological effects were just as startling. Behind the pineapple rows, new crops took root. Onions, beans, and even tomatoes found shade and shelter from wind. With the soil stabilized, water retention improved. Bees returned, pollinating both the fruit and native flowers. Birdsong replaced silence. Even animals adapted. Goats fed on cuttings. Chickens found bugs in the mulched earth. Livestock stayed healthier, thanks to improved forage and better-fed farmers. One farmer put it simply, "The pineapples feed us, but they also feed the land." What began as a gamble had become a pattern, a replicable, visible pattern. And across Africa, people noticed. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Senegal, and even Chad came to study the fields. Development experts, once critical, revised their reports. What was dismissed as symbolism now stood as evidence. But Traore didn't gloat. He warned. Success, he said, is only meaningful if it spreads. And with that, he extended the vision: a Sahelian pineapple corridor, a shared wall of fruit and resilience linking nations through soil instead of treaties. The consequences weren't just local, they were continental. Burkina Faso, once framed as a climate victim, now shaped the climate conversation. For decades, it had received donations. Now it exported strategy. That shift from recipient to replicator was perhaps the greatest consequence of all. To the casual observer, it might still look like agriculture, but those who paid closer attention saw something else entirely. This wasn't just about growing fruit. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement between Africa and the world. For decades, Burkina Faso had lived within externally defined parameters. Its role in the global system was clear supplier of raw materials, recipient of assistance, object of concern. A country too often seen through the lens of drought debt or conflict. But by planting pineapples and planting them where no one thought possible, Traore had staged something far more radical than a reforestation project. He had turned Burkina Faso into a symbol of self-determined adaptation. First, he weaponized ecology. The wall of sweetness wasn't just a defense against the desert. It was a barrier against dependency. While others waited for billion-dollar climate funds or advanced Western technology, Burkina Faso responded with roots, sweat, and shovels. Where the world saw scarcity, Traore saw strategy. Second, he redefined value. For years, Africa's exports were dictated by foreign demand: oil, gold, cocoa, rare minerals. But fruit, that was soft power. Juice and wine, dried snacks and concentrates. These didn't just feed people, they fed perception. Suddenly, Burkina Faso wasn't only a site of struggle, it was a source of sweetness. And that sweetness carried its own kind of leverage. Markets in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East began importing Burkina Faso's pineapple products. Diaspora communities across Paris, Toronto, and Dubai proudly purchased Sahel Gold snacks and wines, not for charity, but for quality, for the story behind the flavor. Third, he decentralized resilience. Most climate adaptation strategies rely on scale-massive dams, international grants, regional programs. But Traore flipped the logic. He localized it. Each cooperative, each village became a micro-laboratory of resilience. Burkina Faso didn't wait for perfect conditions. It planted through failure. And by doing so, it created a model that other resource-strapped nations could actually follow. Fourth, he fortified sovereignty. Where most leaders might have sold future harvests to multinationals in exchange for loans, Traore did the opposite. He blocked exclusive contracts. He banned foreign control over processing plants. He made sure that ownership, not just production, remained local. We will export fruit, he repeated, but never our future. This wasn't anti-trade. It was smart trade. It was a message that Africa could engage the global market on its own terms, not as a junior partner, but as a co-architect. And behind it all was a psychological coup. For years, young people in the Sahel had been told to dream of escape, leave the land, leave the country, chase opportunity elsewhere. But suddenly staying became a form of ambition. Running juice, stands packaging dried fruit, designing labels, managing exports. This wasn't just farming, it was entrepreneurship. A generation raised in the shadow of drought was now building businesses on land once considered dead. The strategy worked because it was layered. Agriculture gave food, ecology gave stability, economy gave employment, politics gave control, culture gave meaning, and together they gave back what no donor ever could: dignity. The West took notice, not always comfortably. Traditional pineapple exporters in Costa Rica, the Philippines, and Côte d'Ivoire began lobbying against what they called Sahel disruption. Some European distributors raised concerns over quality control, but buyers pushed back. They weren't just buying sweetness. They were buying a story, and the story was irresistible. The African Union saw it too. In a televised summit, Traore raised a pineapple crown before the assembly and declared, "This is not just fruit. It is freedom in edible form." The Sahel does not have to be a symbol of sorrow. It can be a source of strength. And the applause didn't stop for minutes. Other nations responded. Mali expanded its plantation belt. Senegal integrated pineapple planting into its coastal erosion strategy. Niger announced a national pineapple pilot zone. A regional alliance began forming, not based on minerals, not on oil, but on fruit. The Sahel, once synonymous with hardship, had birthed a corridor of resilience, a fruit belt, a story belt, a sovereignty belt, and in a world racing for answers to climate change, food insecurity, and migration. Burkina Faso had offered one rooted not in debt, but in dirt. The world once called this land barren, but the people called it home. They were told they couldn't feed themselves. They planted fruit. They were told the desert would swallow them. They fought it with spades. They were told no one would care. They made the world watch. In 5 years, a country once framed as fragile became a lighthouse not of perfection, but of persistence. It didn't wait for saviors. It became one. The pineapples didn't just grow, they taught. That resilience is not rare. It's just rarely supported. That sovereignty doesn't begin at the ballot box. It begins in the soil. That abundance is not a miracle. It is a strategy. So if you ever doubted Africa, look again. If you ever doubted the Sahel, listen closely. And if you ever doubted that the poorest nations could lead the richest conversations, then ask yourself, why are they watching us now? And if you still believe in justice and dignity in a world where even the most forgotten soil can bear fruit, then share this story. Because the harvest was not just pineapples, it was pride. And that, too, is something worth planting.